Now, I want to talk more about the funeral in a second. It was so huge and so beautiful and so monumental and also seen by so many that I think it's going to have a huge cultural effect. And I want to talk about that with my next guest, but not before we just deal with two things that tell us whether World War III really is going to break out, because huge things are going on in the world while billions of us are distracted by what's going on in Britain. Now, I've said the war in Ukraine is the first battle of World War III. If Russia gets away with its invasion, it will keep going, and its ally China will think it can get away with also invading Taiwan. It's as simple as that. Well, given that, this could be good news. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin met Chinese dictator Xi Jinping at a summit of Asian nations in Uzbekistan. They pledged their support for each other, which is certainly concerning. But Putin did say at that meeting, and this is very interesting, that he noted China's concerns about the war in Ukraine without explaining what those concerns were. But there was another sign of that summit, that Putin is now being treated as a broken reed, even a pariah, by countries that have up till now been generally friendly to him. Now, normally Putin is so arrogant he makes other leaders wait for him at meetings, sometimes for an hour. But this time, the president of Kyrgyzstan kept him waiting. The president of Azerbaijan kept him waiting too, and looking embarrassed. The president of Turkey kept Putin waiting, and so did the Prime Minister of India. And when Prime Minister Modi did finally arrive, he criticised Putin to his face and publicly for going to war.
आज का युग युद्ध का है नहीं, और हमने फोन पर भी कई बार आपसे इस विषय में बात की है.
Joining me is the country's best writer on foreign affairs, Greg Sheridan of the Australian newspaper. Greg, thanks for your time. This wasn't an accident.
Andrew.
Putin was being snubbed, it seems to me, humiliated even by countries he's been close to. But how significant is this?
Oh, Andrew, I think it's quite significant. This has been a good few weeks for Ukraine. Few of us dared believe Ukraine could defeat Russia in a war, but we should have remembered that Poland defeated the new Soviet Union in a war, a century ago. Look, it's not all over yet, and Putin still has a few moves up his sleeve, but there's one thing that dictators don't like, and that's a loser. And Putin looks a loser at the moment. Now, the war's not over, and there are still things Putin can do, terrible things. The best hope, I think, is that he decides to quit while he's behind and negotiate some kind of ceasefire. Whether the Ukrainians would accept that now, I don't know. But no, you're right to highlight all these optics. Being snubbed in public by Xi and Modi and by these little Central Asian former Soviet states, that shows that Putin is a very diminished figure indeed.
Now, there's another signal, Greg, that I think suggests that the free world is stepping up to stop the war in Ukraine spreading into a world war, with China then invading democratic Taiwan, which it claims is Chinese. The US has a policy for many years now of not confirming or denying it will defend Taiwan militarily if China invades. But for the fourth time now, President Biden has said straight out that the US will defend Taiwan. And this time, you can't dismiss it, as we perhaps have done in the past, as Biden simply forgetting what the official position of the US really is. Here he is.
Would U.S. forces defend the island?
Yes, if in fact there was an unprecedented attack.
So unlike Ukraine, to be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion?
Yes.
How big is this, Greg?
So, Andrew, I think this is a very big development indeed. Clearly, either Biden didn't misspeak before, or they've decided to make a virtue out of what happened. But I think this now is legitimate American strategic ambiguity. So the official White House position is the policy hasn't changed, but the policy always was a bit less ambiguous than people said. The US was always going to defend Taiwan unless Taiwan provoked war through some wildly irresponsible action, such as a formal de jure declaration of independence. Now, one of the big problems, I think, has been whether the Taiwanese themselves are committed to really fighting to the death to preserve their own independence. The reason I say that is because they've never organised their armed forces in a maximal way to resist the Chinese in the way the Ukrainians have done in resisting the Russians. They put all their faith in the Americans simply preventing China from ever taking that risk. It seems to me now the subtext of Biden's message is to the Taiwanese people, we will come and help you, so you fight, because probably in the event of a war, you would need the Taiwanese to hold out for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before the Americans could deploy all the firepower that they would need to repel and defeat the Chinese. And I think Biden is kind of stiffening Taiwan's resolve while not formally changing policy. I think that's a pretty good exercise in American statecraft and a good exercise of American power.
Absolutely. Greg, but to the Queen's funeral yesterday, I thought it was astonishing to see Britain put on, again, such a magnificent ceremony, so faultless too, and beautiful and majestic, like the scenes of the Queen's coffin on a catafalque being pulled by Navy sailors, so redolent of tradition, and like the wonderful service there. There was also the awesome slow march taking her for burial at Windsor Castle with more huge crowds, and also a favourite horse brought out for a last goodbye, and of course her corgis there to say goodbye too. But however awesome these ceremonials were, or other touching details like a Lord Chamberlain snapping his wand of office and laying it on her coffin, what struck me most, Greg, was the genuine love and the gratitude of the crowds. This time throwing flowers on her hearse, for instance, sometimes applauding, sometimes giving 3 cheers, God save the Queen. I think culturally this has got to have a huge effect, not just on Britain, but perhaps throughout the Commonwealth.
Yes, Andrew, I agree with you. It was a wonderful, wonderful ceremony, and fabulous to see a country celebrating its traditions as the Brits have been doing just now, whereas, you know, most of the Western ideological madness says we're not allowed to have our traditions. You know, alone amongst all the people in the world, Western traditions are never to be honoured. I'm less convinced about its long-term cultural consequence. Queen Elizabeth was a magnificent monarch, almost faultless, as near to faultless as you could get. Charles, I think, has been quite a daffy public figure, you know, honestly, lecturing us about talking to plants and listening to them in return. And he's also been quite a political public figure, you know, making it clear even quite recently that he bitterly opposed his own government's immigration policy, and all the rest of us constantly lecturing us about climate change. Now, if he's going to emulate his mother at all, he has to completely reverse his personality. Also, he's not the admirable character that his mother was. But, you know, the genius of monarchy is that you don't need to be a good person to be a good monarch. And I'm not suggesting he's not a good person, but you just need to shut up and turn up to the ceremonial occasions and not say anything other than the 80 approved royal cliches. Now, if he does that, and for us, I think he's a good monarch. We don't identify, I have no emotional identification with Charles, not at all. But I want the monarchy there because it is the guarantee of our Constitution, and it's the Constitution which protects us from the depredations of crazy elites from time to time more than anything else.
Yeah, but I thought the magnificence of the ceremonials and the constant references to the Queen's fidelity to duty will have an impact on Charles, will imprison him in part. Well, one would hope. I think it'll be a moment of personal weakness if he lets the old activists get out. Just very quickly, I've actually run out of time, Greg, but I do want a very quick response from you on this, because you've written great books of Christianity. The Queen got this love without ever telling people what she thought about politics. She did it through service and self-restraint. And I thought there was a connection here with the Christian faith. It's a faith that's getting rarer here. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, I thought, was very clear in pointing that out in his wonderful sermon. Have a listen.
In 1953, the Queen began her coronation with silent prayer, just there, at the high altar. Her allegiance to God was given before any person gave allegiance to her. Her service to so many people in this nation, the Commonwealth and the world, had its foundation in her following Christ. People of loving service are rare in any walk of life. Leaders of loving service are still rarer. But in all cases, those who serve will be loved and remembered when those who cling to power and privileges are long forgotten.
Your response, Greg Sheridan?
Well, Andrew, you're right. The Queen truly was a believing Christian. She said so many times very clearly, and she was not a liar. I don't know that Charles has ever asserted that he's a believing Christian. That's no criticism of him. You don't have to be a believing Christian to be the king. But I think her deep, genuine faith was sincere, and it's, you know, she was a whole. You couldn't slice one part of her from another. And it may be true that we will never see her like again. And she deserves every tribute she's got in the last 10 days.
Greg Sheridan, thank you so much for your time.